Shall we call the meeting to order? Get started so we can get it done. I'd like to call the 13th December meeting of Finance and Planning to order. A little bit of business first, a little disclaimer statement. Official recordings, videos, or transcriptions of HSV Property Owners Association committee meetings and/or board meetings will be done by authorized personnel only and can be viewed on the HSV Property Owner Association YouTube channel and explorethevillage.com. Any other recording, video, or transcription of HSV Property Owners Association committee meetings and/or board meetings is not considered the official record of the Property Owners Association. That said, next item on the agenda was minutes from the previous meeting.
And I found a typo. I corrected snooze to smooth, even though I really thought it was a pretty cool word once I thought about it a little.
I kind of liked it myself.
I'll talk to Webster about
When
it.
in
But
doubt, create a cool word.
And then Tom had a change that I don't remember at this point.
I remember it.
I tried to look back this morning, but my computer was not working, so, and Larry had one that I thought it said that by what it was already in there, so I left it as it was.
Okay.
About it actually being savings, even though it's counterintuitive. You explained counterintuitive more, but I didn't think it was necessary, and it
That's
was
fine.
easier this way.
And you included me as being present.
Yes, I included Becky as being president too. It snoozed the way for the rest of us.
Okay.
Okay, I move that we approve the amended minutes.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? No? Okay, cool. The only thing I've got on the agenda today, unless anybody else has something they wanna put up there, is what I call version 2 of the working capital funds policy. Thanks to Kathy for doing the heavy lifting on that update. She put fingers to keyboard here a couple weeks ago and sent in a pretty extensive update. I incorporated the vast majority of her material, and then I made a few edits here and there just to try to clean things up. Got commentary from Tom and commentary from Jeff, which I have not really had a chance to incorporate since I was out of town, but look like reasonable comments. I figured we can go through those over the next little bit. Is there anything else that we want to put on the agenda, or is that what we have today? I guess from the silence, that's what we have today. I do have a couple things I'd like to check on when we get done with the agenda item, but it's more action item check for me than anything else. So with that, let's see. If you don't mind, Jeff, I'll start with yours, just because it happens to be up on top. I think it was, yep.
All right, I'll just go through mine if that helps, and then we can you can either tell me I'm out to lunch, or we can say that sounds good. So just in section 1, purpose, in the second sentence, it said working capital funds are intended to be used to accumulate reserves. I don't think it's reserves, it's cash. So I'd change that word to cash. In the next sentence, it talks about periodically investing in maintenance, repair, and expansion of Hot Springs Village physical facilities. I expanded that out to say infrastructure, utilities, and fleet as defined in the OMT tables, just to be a little bit more complete, because physical facilities might be too limiting. And I would be open to expanding that even further if we think that there are other specific areas that aren't covered by those general terms. I do think it needs to cover what we identified as the high priority areas that are mentioned in the other policy document that that the board recently approved. That's my view.
To expand on your physical facilities, I assume that it would include things like systems, software, and phone systems, which people may or may not think of
So
this.
that's a good point, so I think maybe it's worth adding physical facilities, IT.
Something.
Right, and that way, that covers that, potential area, which it can be expensive and could be done early in the year so that people don't have to not live with new computers or laptops or whatever.
Would systems kind of cover that?
I was just trying to tie it to
Yeah,
our
I'm
budget.
trying to find a
'cause
word for what
It'd be
Tom
better
is-
if, cleaner if it's tied to our budget categories than to put some nebulous term, that would be my
Yeah.
only thought.
And the thought process of when we were setting all of this up last year was, and this is just my point of view, so you guys please give me your input, is it could be, encompass all of our capital assets being purchased.
Yes.
You know, so maybe if we referenced, you know, all the capital items related to the approved budget, or, I don't know, like I said. I wasn't thinking of it in just categories. I would like to get to where we're prepared to be able to get all of our capital as needed, not necessarily waiting.
To open up a little can of worms there, I later on made a comment, when you're talking about things like roadside maintenance and dredging, I think intuitively, it includes, in my mind, it includes stuff like that. But dredging isn't, I thought, something you would capitalize.
Correct,
No.
it's under my.
So-
It's under operations.
Right, but I mean, just how much attention do we need to make that distinction in this document? Do we overemphasize it? We never actually say capitalization, but we kind of hint and beat around the bush when we say maintenance, repair. It does cover that depending upon how technical you'll get about what maintenance means. But I think we all agree it does include mowing the sides of the roads and chopping down trees and yanking tree stumps and dredging out dirt.
Well, and really you're broadening it further than I did. And so maybe that's an area that we should go down. I was looking at it as, these are operational expenses that need to be covered in the budget. Those all get covered first, and then it comes into, okay, you know, we're cutting capital when it comes down to the budget being prepared. So that's why I was thinking that it as capital funds being set aside. But you bring up a good point, so.
I mean, do we think that the intention of the capital, in spite of the word capital funds, to include stuff like dredging, which is not capitalized? And that's a technical issue, and I don't know how deep we want to.
It confuses me because I don't think of this as being a fund that is used for operation and is used for maintenance.
That's what I was getting at, is
And
those
and
are
so I
fundamental.
see that as being separate, but I'm having some trouble trying to understand what we're doing and what we're trying to cover and how we're trying to get there.
It depends on what you mean to me when you say operations. If you're talking about paying the electricity bill and salaries and buying toner, I don't think that's what this is here for. But when we reviewed the O&M tables, things like dredging lakes was very
Well, I
prominent.
guess the difference between dredging lakes and operations from my standpoint is currently we contract that,
Correct.
all right?
Mhm.
We do not do it in-house. We cut a contract in order to do the dredging of the lakes. If you don't have the money to cut the contract and we want to start dredging the lake in February and you haven't collected enough cash to cover that contract, we don't start in February. That's what we're trying to stop doing.
That's
We
what I said.
need to quit delaying the execution of the budget until we collect up enough cash. Instead, we need to utilize this cash smartly in the beginning of the year where those things where we haven't collected enough revenue, because hopefully we'll start eliminating rollover money and we can execute that contract in February because we have some funds available to cover the cash outlay required. And then as we collect in revenue, you replenish it back in because that was a budgeted item, so we're supposed to be collecting money and paying that back.
No, and that's why I brought up that I wasn't originally thinking of it that way. I was thinking of it as pertaining to the capital listing in itself, because that's where we make our cuts.
Yeah.
But the point being brought up by Tom, I think, would help encompass some of those other areas if we were to find ourselves in a situation, you know, to your example, and we have in the past.
I just don't know enough about that, like dredging or some of those, whether they're hampered by cash flow.
I see it as a parallel need. You need it for both, what I'm gonna call routine operation, and I would throw dredging in there, I would throw the grass cutting in there, the contracts to get fertilizer.
So it really changes the dynamic. So the question comes, do you want it to be a source where, like I said in the beginning, the thought process was in order to go out and make your capital purchases? Or do you want it to be used as pretty much a line of credit held by ourselves for any cash flow needs?
So could I ask a
Because there's
question
money
to
in
help,
that.
maybe help us all think through that? Given that you've seen a number of budgets now go through, which ones are we classically delaying?
Capital.
Capital. Okay, so maybe we go capital and then we can assess later on if we need to do something different.
So then we would be able to take out the maintenance part of this, because that's not really capital.
That was my initial thought. Like I said, I mean, I think there's different views to look at it, and we need to come up with what's gonna be the best solution overall. But dredging is gonna be your most expensive one-time hit that does not get classified as capital. And this is a high year, and it was at 400,000. And I think that's about the highest we should anticipate to see it. And in fact, if we are to stay on a schedule going forward of some sort, granted that the schedule needs to be reanalyzed, those costs should dramatically go down, because over these first few years, they hadn't been dredged for so long that the cost was increased dramatically. So if they're hauling out less garbage, it should
Yeah.
be more maintainable.
So I heard a couple of different thoughts. Let me see if I can caught them accurately. So I think the first question was, when we say working capital, are we really talking capital in the sense of capital expenditures, or are we talking capital in the sense of funds that the POA can use to execute their business? And I just, while that conversation was going on, I just went and pulled up a definition on Google of working capital, and I'm not sure it's necessarily helpful. You know, but it basically said it's a financial metric which represents operating liquidity available to a business, organization, or other entity, along with fixed assets such as plant and equipment. Working capital is considered part of operating capital. Of course, all of those terms, everything's embedded with capital, so I don't know that necessarily
Yeah.
gives us the flexibility that we would like.
I think capital is
So-
more represented as cash, and when you think of it in that way versus just fixed assets, it's all, it more represents cash and what it is used to execute.
So I guess the risk that we're talking about here is if we use a broader definition beyond a capital expenditure and versus an operating expenditure is that would there be a chance that capital projects would suffer because we've opened the door to operating budget items to whittle away at this in a way that doesn't allow us to get after the capital projects? That's the risk, right? So the risk is if we give the POA maximum flexibility, it might backfire, or do we tighten it down a little bit to give the POA a little bit more guidance in this policy to stay focused on the capital projects? that's really, I think, where we are. It depends on what we think history would tell us in where we are being slowed down in executing the budget. Is it driven more on operating or capital projects? What Karina has told us is it's driven more by capital projects than operating projects.
And for that reason, I would say limit it to capital projects, because this really isn't a slush fund, if you will.
Right.
It's for the things that are rolled over and that we need to use, it's just to equalize it, so we don't have the barrier, we've gotta spend everything in 2021. Let's do this in 2022. I'd leave it at capital, because with the assessment vote going through,
Yeah.
it just makes sense.
So Kathy, your suggestion, we take out maintenance and repair.
But you can still do maintenance and repair on a capital asset, like a building that needs to be done.
Okay, so then we
Okay.
need to define it more like you're saying.
Well, if you want to get technical about it, and that's why we need CPAs and accountants, can you say things that are capitalized?
So items which are capitalized.
If that's the limitation, and, I don't do the books, I don't know.
That's a little bit of a over limitation, isn't it? Because capital projects have operational expenses that go along with them. Am I
Yeah.
right?
So for example, if you had a large piece of machinery that has several components, just because one component of that large machine costs $20,000, doesn't mean you're gonna necessarily capitalize it if it does not equate to replacing 60% of that machine.
Okay.
So, yes, you can have costs that you have to evaluate with the overall asset value and how much you're replacing and so forth. So, maintenance costs, depending on how they get accounted for, I should back up. Maintenance costs can qualify as an asset or as a maintenance.
Is there a better way to say this than just using the word maintenance and repair? Would you say capitalized maintenance and repair?
You could,
Or is there a
yes.
better way? I'm not a specialist, so I'm,
Yeah, do you have a suggestion, Karina? Because as to the terms used.
Well,
You're the one who's using it.
Yeah,
everybody's looking.
I'm gonna throw something in. So, I'm still struggling like everybody else. How do we say what we're thinking? It's not even clear what we're thinking, but anyway, maybe if we.
I disagree with you, Tom. What do you mean we're not clear what we're thinking? Do we not all agree of what the use of this money is for?
Generally, yes, but
Okay.
We
specifically,
agree
no. And, okay, for one thing, when I look at, I'm gonna hear this discussion, it says maintenance, repair, and expansion of, instead of physical facilities, are we now saying capital items, things that have been capitalized at one point? Or things that represent capital items? And again, I don't know if that helps. The second is, in your example, when you say, a big hunk of thing and there's 20,000, and we put 20,000 in the budget, is it essentially in the operating end, or is it in the capital end? When I look at the OMT tables in your example, where would I find the 20,000?
So typically, honestly, you're not gonna end up seeing that in the budget, because
Okay.
it's gonna be a maintenance repair that it has come up immediately, so that's something that'd be brought to the
Okay.
board to say, hey, this has come up and we need to address it.
Because,
Under normal,
That would typically be expense, probably.
yes.
okay. Because then when I look at saying as defined in the updated operations and maintenance tables, that also seems to be a limitation that, in your example, I'm just struggling with it, so, I don't know.
see, and I guess I like that part of it. Is there, what Jeff said, I thought, here's how I would read it: to accumulate, the second line, to accumulate cash that will be used periodically to invest in the maintenance, repair, and expansion of physical facilities, IT, infrastructure, utilities, and fleet as defined in the updated O&M tables. To me, that kind of said it, didn't it?
I think that gives you enough flexibility, so for example, if you did have something come up that would be classified as a repair that you did not expect, that is still a large expenditure, this would allow these funds to help take care of that in a timely manner.
If they were defined in the O and M. If they just come up, they're not, are they?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I
Okay.
mean, you're not
Okay.
gonna know that you're gonna have a repair 6 months down the road.
But that isn't what this is supposed to be used for.
And I would agree with you, Kathy. I would say an emergency repair of something is not what this fund is designed for. This is designed for prudent planning, okay, where we talk about it as we develop the budget. We say that there's this item that's gonna cost a fair amount of money, but we wanna execute in January or February. And we say, yep, we're not gonna have collected enough revenue by then, so we're going to execute using this fund. And as we collect that revenue that we were already planning to spend on, we'll fill the coffers back up. That's what, I think, if it's not deliberate in that mindset, I think it will be really hard for you and for all of us to know what's going on with the funds. If it's a pop-up emergency type of thing, then I think the general manager and the team have to come up with how do we address that and propose forward how you're gonna manage that.
I think that is the way to keep it the simplest. So the whole point of this comes back to what he's describing very well, is take this year, or take 2021's budget, for example. You have $4 million in capital. Okay, you back out all of the capital under normal circumstances, we should be able to meet all of our operating expenses. Otherwise, there really needs to be a reevaluation of things that are taking place. However, when it's come to doing the capital, and that's why I said all the expenses go in first, and then capital is typically where we have to make all of our cuts. So if we built $4 million in, and they all need to go out and get all of this equipment in the beginning of the year, I have to spread it out for cash flow. And what's happened in the past is they would execute early. Then revenue did not come in that they had expected, so all spending for capital would come to a halt in July. The last several years that I'm aware of, no capital expenditures were able to take place after July. So the whole point of trying to do this is to have the money set aside to be able to execute those in the timely fashion that's needed. I don't think it would be wise to open it up to any and everything, because then it really does become like it's our own working line of credit. And we wouldn't be evaluating whatever situation we may be in as much as we need to, because we have that extra pool.
So here's a proposal. If we think about that way, that sentence reads, working capital funds are intended to be used to accumulate cash that will be used periodically to invest in capital projects, okay, of Hot Springs Village. And then we could go parentheses if we wanted to list them out, as defined in the updated operations and maintenance table. And then maybe, is that too limiting in the proposed budget?
I like having that
Because
expansion.
that's where you're gonna make the call on if you're gonna use it or not.
Jeff, I like your expansion, so that allows you to save for future too.
Yeah, I could live with that. But I'm just taking out the maintenance, repair, and focus on the project.
Yep.
The capital project that we have discussed as we prepared the budget for the next year. And based on the planning that goes into it, says we wanna execute that one right up front. Okay, great, this money will help us get there as we're collecting revenue at the beginning of the year. Which then should make capital projects later in the year easier to execute on budget.
That seems to me to provide enough flexibility, so when you say capital projects, it's not capitalized projects, and there's a big difference. Capital projects include the expenses, the operations, costs of the capital project, correct? Well,
Any cost that's gonna go into a capital project will be capitalized.
okay. So
You're gonna capitalize it as a whole.
okay, I think then I think what Jeff said is great.
I can live with that.
And that's one thing we're working on right now. Just as an FYI, and I think I've brought it up before, there are situations where they've expensed some items thinking that it did not have to go with that particular capital project. And that's not the case. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's digging out a water line in order to do this project. If you do anything, even if it would normally be an expense, in order to get this project done, you accumulate all those costs together and capitalize it.
Yeah.
And that's a learning curve for some, and we're working through identifying
Yeah.
that.
So if you had to dig up a line under a street, not only would the cost associated with digging up the line be part of that capital expenditure, the repair of the street, because you had to dig the hole,
Yes.
is also part of the same. Yeah. Got it.
And that includes both in-house and contracted.
Yeah, it doesn't matter who you're paying or where it's coming from, it's, yeah.
Just to make sure we're clear on terminology, and boy, do I hate getting into wordsmithing, which we do a lot of. When we say project, I mean, we buy a lot of just pumps, and we capitalize the pump. And we replace the old broken down one. That is a project.
So,
As,
in reference to the pumps,
Yeah.
and yes, that has gone back and forth in how it's been treated over the last couple of years. Sometimes it's been expense, sometimes it's been capital. And the way it currently is right now, all new pumps going in get capitalized as one big project.
right,
Okay.
okay.
All new pumps going in are capitalized. All existing pump replacements are a maintenance expense.
And the same would be true of a purchase of a truck. That's a quote project. And I'm fine with that, it's just, it's not how people intuitively think of the word project, but I think when we buy a truck, we capitalize it.
I don't reference everything as whether it's a project,
Oh, I understand that, but
one way or the other.
I just want to avoid somebody saying buying a truck is not a project, therefore it is not subject to this. And it's like, well, the intent for me is this covers the purchase of trucks.
Yes. I look at it as capital or operating.
Right,
That's the way I look at it.
Right.
Now, you will have capital single items, and it's just capital. You may have a capital project because it encompasses many different pieces coming
Right.
together
Okay.
to complete that.
okay,
So I look at it as
right.
capital or
Mhm.
operating.
Well, so would I. We're trying to write a document here.
And here I come up with another question, because I don't understand accounting on the level you do it. But with the lease projects, because you included fleet with this, and since we're leasing a few things, the leasing is an expense, is it not? Or is it
So actually, right
capitalized?
now, yes, it is. The lease is structured as an operating lease. But with the new rules coming into place, it will be classified as capital.
Capital.
Okay.
So-
New county rule.
Yes, under ASC 842.
I didn't know the old rules, so the new ones were way beyond me, but okay, good.
But
Yeah,
you're
or
not
go
gonna
ahead.
have that cash outlay, so I don't think this fund should come into play necessarily with that.
These funds, I mean.
Yes.
But in the future, I don't
But
understand.
even when it crosses over and we record it on the balance sheet
Okay.
as a capital and as a liability, you're looking at a minimal amount cash outlay every month.
Right,
That's already a spread. I look at this as, we need to go out and buy a $450,000 piece of equipment.
A new fire truck,
right.
or a
Yes.
bulldozer, or a dump truck, or
Okay.
something that's outside the lease. Because the lease is gonna be the
One
set
time.
cost over time,
Yes.
which shouldn't be stressing of our budget.
Yes.
But Tom, back to your point, so if you don't like projects, I mean, what would be the
Well,
term?
it's,
Capital expense, capital
it's
what?
not that I don't like the word project, I just want this group to agree and understand that, you know, the term project, I mean, I definitely have a mindset, but I'm okay with changing the mindset to a very, very broad definition of project. That's all. I'm fine with, I think, what we're discussing.
What if you did capital purchases outlaid in the budget? I mean, that's where it's gonna come from, or capital purchases.
I'm fine with that.
Doesn't,
If I'm understanding correctly, essentially, your application of this is really gonna be, is it a capital expense per the accounting, the GAAP practices? If it's a capital expense per the GAAP practices, then it's, these funds are a candidate to source,
Eligible for the discussion.
eligible for the discussion. If it's an expense item, then it's not going to be eligible for that discussion.
that's the way I was originally looking at it. Like I said, you know, I understand that it may restrict us in some capacities, but I think,
It's probably good, though, that we do that.
Well, but it
Yeah.
keeps it clean. You know,
Yes.
the good news is it keeps it clean. You don't have to worry about defining what is, because
So
GAAP
what term would you
practices have
like?
already defined it for you.
That's it. Capital,
what did I say, a second ago?
I don't know what's on tape, so. I think you just said capital or between.
Expenditures?
Yeah.
It's a lovely phrase, and I wish I remember what it was. I understand what you're saying.
I mean, the industry term is CapEx. But, you know, that's an informal industry term. I don't think you find it in textbooks.
What if we just, well, I wouldn't restrict
capital
it.
budget item?
Approved capital, or,
I mean, if you really want to put a small box around it, you refer to the approved capital budget. Stuff that's, that's technical term is stuff.
now,
That's been approved in the budget.
but to play devil's advocate, what if there's something that there was an accident or something got destroyed or whatever the case may be, and we need to replace that, and it was not originally
I think
budgeted?
we can accommodate that in another paragraph. Mhm. I mean, if we need to,
I would contend if it's an emergency, then that's why we have emergency reserves.
well, but we really put a pretty tight box around the
We were
emergency
hoping
reserve.
emergency reserves would be the very, very last
Yeah.
Right.
pocket we dug into.
Yeah.
But I mean,
And they
I
were
think-
major things.
Yeah, I think we can, it's acceptable to me to put in another paragraph that just refers to emergencies.
But I think if we left off the budget and we just said approved
Yeah.
capital,
Yeah,
then that can be anything that the board has approved that has come up as an,
that's fine too.
And to your point, if you have one of those moments where you have a major failure mid-year, you know, in order to accommodate that, there's going to have to be that exercise that we go through to say, okay, this is broken, how do we pay for it? You know, what do we need to replace it, how do we pay for it? That's gonna need to be updated, you know, the budgets and capital projects, whatever they might happen to be, will have to be updated as a function of that, and somebody may end up not getting as much as they thought they were going to get
Yeah.
this year in order to pay for the break, okay? But the mechanical aspects of doing all of that are already gonna have to be done.
yes. I mean, we saw that this year, in order to accommodate for the added expense that wasn't factored in for, federal excise tax on the sanitation trucks, we took the pothole patch trailer off to help cover those expenses.
Yep.
All right, so let me read this again then, based on that discussion. Working capital funds are intended to be used to accumulate cash that will be used periodically to invest in approved capital of Hot Springs Village POA as defined in the updated operations and maintenance table and approved budget.
Were we gonna leave in there the expansion?
Well, since we just said approved capital, that will
That
be
takes care of it.
discussed in the OMT eventually make the approved budget.
So you wanna leave the word budget in there then?
Somehow I think if it's only in the OMT, it's not tied to the actual process where it would be decided upon.
Well, that's
which
why I
is the
said
budget.
approved capital.
So you don't want the budget in there?
I think you should. I think it gives you more flexibility, but I don't
Should we
understand how you
cover-
operate from an accounting standpoint.
Well, I think you'd get to the same place either way, because when you think of approved budget, you think of whatever your, like in this case, calendar year 22 budget baseline's gonna be. But if you get 6 months down the road and something happens, there's gonna be a Rev 1 to the budget baseline to accommodate. The example you used just a bit ago is perfect for that. You know, you get in there and realize that there was some kind of a cost that was skipped during the initial review. Well, okay, how does that, where does that money come from? You know, so the budget was adjusted accordingly, so you had an errata to the budget to account for the change. No big deal.
I guess I was thinking the approved budget beginning with not the fact of adjustments that we've had to make over time.
Yeah.
Which, and I haven't gone in and adjusted the budget. I have noted why there are any variances to it. So,
I'm not an accountant, but that sounds like tomato to me, but I'm not an
it is,
accountant.
it is.
Well, my only concern with the way we have it right now would be is we say approved capital, and then we go on to say as defined in the updated operations and maintenance table. Now, that's done before the budget's approved, okay? Then we have an approved budget, which should then define which of the projects, I'm sorry, I use projects, but which capital assets are gonna be executed with this money, going forward. So if it stops at OMT, there's a whole bunch of the process that it doesn't talk to. So to me, that sentence is incomplete. Now, we could put a period at OMT and then talk about the rest of it, but I was just trying to, in one sentence, wrap a bow around it.
Yeah, because I think the reality of it is, you start the budget cycle with the OMT table. Then reality intrudes.
Right, then you gotta make your tough choices,
Yeah.
and then you have to figure out what are your high priority items, and then
Yeah.
of that, then as you get to finalize the budget, then you need to decide of those finalized items, which ones of those are going to be eligible to use or do we need to use this flexibility to move out on? Right.
And not just which projects, but either which projects, as in some may fall away, or what funding levels various projects are, which may not reflect what you really wanted to do in the OMT table, but it may be the best you can do with the money you have. I'm inclined to like the OMT and approved budget personally. I don't think that's limiting to the POA. I mean, I might be wrong.
Would you want it OMT and approved budget, or approved budget? It's a small thing, but I think it
I
makes a
think
big
it's an
difference.
and.
You want it in
Because,
both.
well, the in part because one of the exercises that has yet to be engaged in, because the OMT is new, now that we've got a 22 budget baseline, there were items in the OMT table that were slated for 2022 that didn't make the cut. So the OMT table needs to be updated to reflect what was actually budgeted in 22. The things that didn't make the cut in 22 need to be redistributed into, going forward into the next 6 years of the OMT table. And we need to create year plus one out on the end of the OMT table. And those are those things that we were trying to figure out a while back exactly where they were gonna slot in the timeline. You know, but now that we've got a budget and we know how much is gonna be allocated, there's an exercise associated with keeping that OMT table fresh. So I think it's an and, because if I've got a disconnect between the OMT table and the approved budget, that tells me I have a task that hasn't been completed yet.
That makes sense.
I think it also ties us to the planning viewpoint. In other words, this should be ideally thought about, you know, that we're gonna use this money for this reason, for this time, because we know we're gonna be cash short, and we need to keep things on plan so that we can make progress as a community.
Yeah.
And not push everything till later and then find a weird stop and then create more turmoil on the back end.
Yep.
All right, gives us something to talk about, I guess, huh? So, do you wanna keep going?
Yeah.
All right, so then the next little edit I had was in the same paragraph, or same section one at the very end. It says, working capital funds are accumulated with the intention that they will be used as an ongoing resource to support village operations. We might want to debate that. And allow timely execution of projects from prior years and/or for which reserves or revenue is anticipated to not yet be collected. I don't think it has anything to do with from prior years.
Oh,
I think it's to allow timely execution of projects, or timely execution of capital, approved capital.
And Tom actually had an edit that was even simpler than that. He basically just said, with the intention that they will be used as an ongoing resource to manage capital spending.
I like that even more
Which kept it nice and tight and
Yeah,
got rid of the run-on sentence.
Yeah,
Well, that, and it took out what I've got a problem with, revenue is anticipated. Not all capital stuff is gonna generate revenue. We're gonna have capital needs, which
no,
may
the
not.
revenue anticipated is the collection of revenue
Yeah.
from assessments,
Yeah.
et cetera.
But it's saying execution of projects from which revenue is anticipated.
Yeah, revenue was gonna be anticipated to pay for that project, but it's not yet collected.
No, but it's saying, we will have projects where we will not get any revenue. And I don't want to limit it to projects where there's only gonna be revenue from those projects. And that's the way this reads to me. But if you go with Tom's suggestion, that takes that whole part of the sentence out.
Can you read what you put in
no,
again?
it's,
Basically,
I know
where,
I've got it in the computer, but I forgot the computer today.
what it said was, working capital funds are accumulated with the intention that they will be used as an ongoing resource to manage capital spending. And the last sentence and a half, or last
Yeah.
line and a half or so just disappeared.
I like that.
I like that.
Yeah,
I do
I think
too.
that's crisp. Because I understand Becky's point there. It wasn't intended that these things only be expended on things that made money.
I'm sure
You
it
know, but that
wasn't.
was but I can understand the confusion.
But I really like the way Tom wrapped it up.
So too.
just
I
throwing
like-
stuff against the wall.
I also like Jeff's words of prudent planning well enough, I'd like to incorporate it in there, that will be used as an ongoing resource for prudent planning to manage capital spending. Probably not necessary, but I thought they were really good.
Okay, so
I
then
think
I
we
went
got
to
it all.
sec,
Would you read it back to us?
well, now that end will read like this, right? So we're gonna make it read, unlike emergency reserve funds, working capital funds are accumulated with the intention that they will be used as an ongoing resource for prudent planning to manage capital spending.
Thumbs up.
Well, can we bring up a topic that we talked about half an hour ago? I observed that probably 6 weeks ago or so, we had a kind of an involved discussion about the term working capital. And, you know, you brought up that, you know, and I have to agree with it, the general usage of the term working capital just essentially means cash. And it could go to anything. And I think, unfortunately, the two people who kind of seem to not like the term working capital most were Ford and Carl, who aren't here.
You typically say fixed assets.
What?
You typically say fixed assets, not capital.
Okay. So in order to just try to cut some degree of confusion, I mean, I suggested striking the word working in all cases and just say capital, and you may even like the term fixed assets better, and I'm fine with fixed assets. I mean, I really do agree that having working capital throughout the document is confusing. We hashed it out in the room, but there's a lot more people who are going to be reading this document than just the 7 people in the room, or however many of us are.
Fixed assets is very precise. That is what you call it. The whole reason I think that they usually hear the word capital is because you capitalize
Right.
those funds
Right.
and record them as a fixed asset. And
But-
that's what this list that's what this will pertain to, is our list of fixed asset purchases.
Right, but that sort of implies, if you continue on, that even at the budget, instead of saying the capital budget, maybe we should say fixed asset budget.
We should.
And that, I think that would probably help go a fairly long way in just getting rid of some confusion, not that, you know, the jillions of numbers floating around isn't confusing enough. But it's just something that, when I read this, that struck me. That conversation about confusing terminology, I took to heart.
The first time I heard it as capital, I was confused too.
But wasn't that the whole discussion we had at the last meeting? And Ford was the one who came up with working capital, I thought.
He was the one that
Yeah.
suggested
Okay.
working
Yeah.
capital.
All right.
Yeah, then- But,
So-
now, were you,
No.
okay.
I mean, I think for the, you know, Karina wasn't in that meeting, so I think for the uninitiated, it feels a little like the turn on the blue light, you know, kind of, as you want it blue, we'll turn on the blue light. From a appropriate accounting terminology standpoint, if the appropriate terminology is fixed assets versus capital, is this a good opportunity to go fix that problem?
Honestly, yeah. And
Okay.
the policy that is out there, and the procedures that we put out for staff,
Mhm.
it's a fixed asset policy.
Okay,
And then there's procedures that document on how to determine whether it's a fixed asset or an operating expense.
okay.
But I just know it's not the terminology widely used.
So it would seem that in order to avoid future confusion and the placing of sticks and spokes by some people who like to do that sort of thing, we might be better off to change the term and call it fixed assets.
But didn't that term come from Ford, who is our resident CPA?
Pardon?
Didn't that term come from
Well,
Ford, who is our resident
We'd
CPA?
have to go back and talk to him.
I think he did say that there's been a change in accounting rules regarding capital, or I could be totally wrong.
He did as far as leases.
I
say
personally
we-
like
I say
fixed
we
asset.
defer the topic and ask Ford
Yeah.
and Carl to tell us what their opinion is, and then we can compare that to what Karina just told us, and then decide when we're gonna.
Agree. I think that's
It's
a
a-
They're
great.
really
it's
our
an easy-
experts.
Yeah, I think that's a great way
Easy
to solve
find
it.
and replace,
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. That is true.
Yeah.
the beauty of Word.
That is true. Okay. Good observation though, Tom. I think the next one was.
All right, the next
2B.
one I had was section 2 and in B, and this is just maybe before we even talk about what I wrote there. it got to be really confusing to me about what we're gonna use the general fund for, which is not the utility fund. Okay, got that, I mean, it's that. And I think even what I wrote is still not quite right. But, you know, we started talking about to be funded through net earnings. Okay, so this is talking about funding of this, excluding water and wastewater operations and funds remaining at year end. All right, so then when I got to funds at year end, immediately I was thinking of rollover funds. That will,
We're not doing rollover funds anymore.
right, so then I was like, okay, so what funds are we talking about that we have at the end of the year?
Well, I think of where it just says through net earnings, if we add it to include, to state, and you guys are better at wording than I am, but, it's your net income including capital, you know. So it's all your revenue, all your expenses, or all of your revenue minus your expenses minus your capital. The only thing that should not be factored into any of that is your depreciation because it is a non-cash item. Your capital is still a cash item.
Yeah, so here's a question I have for you, all right? So we get to the end of the year. If we get to the end of the year and there's probably three scenarios. The first scenario is we had a capital project on the books for the prior year that we're just finishing up, and we didn't execute it for whatever reason.
What do you mean? Oh, the year that we're finishing up?
Yeah, so 2021, so we're about to go into 2022, all right? So we get to 2022 and we look back at 2021 and we see that we had a capital project and we didn't execute it.
Time out. So when you say didn't execute it, you mean not started or started and not finished?
Either or.
Okay.
Okay, so if we didn't start it, then as we go to 22, we have to decide, are we gonna, is that one now no longer needed? Or now we're gonna have to account for it in 22? That's one option. The other option is if we started it and the bill just hadn't come in, then we still have to pay the bill, right? Probably with the money that we already should have set aside in the 21 budget, we're just gonna pay it in 22.
So what typically, so we had 99,000 as carryover for capital purchases this time. And those were projects that were already started, that were not completed, or they'd already placed an order. We didn't have the product yet, but we've already made the commitment.
Right.
So those items were accounted for before we got to any money that was ready to
Right, so
put
that
into-
money shouldn't be part of this whole discussion about funds here, right?
That money, you could put it in here and then turn around and take it out, or you can go ahead and set it aside. I would say just go ahead and set it aside.
I agree with that, because otherwise it just muddies the water here, all right?
And then as far as things that, when they're going down the capital list, so this, we've already presented, here's all your projects that were started, that you said are complete. Here's all the projects that are in progress right now. Here's in the bottom section is everything that you have not started at all. And what I've explained to them all is, if they've already gone out to bid, and they're already into the bid process, that would be accounted for as far as making the selection to account for it to do it the next year. If it's something that they absolutely never got to, didn't think about, and they're not trying to execute it, then they get a start over. And they're not gonna get it into the next year's budget because that's already been approved by the time we get to this month.
Mhm.
They gotta put it in 23. Or why didn't you do it? There's probably a reason.
Yeah,
There are pieces, there are projects, capital items that were on the list that they did execute, but it did not meet the capital threshold that we just set in place. So it shows 0, but we know we've already executed it and we put it into non-cap, so that it has no cost there, but I know we're not carrying anything forward, because it is done and executed in one form or fashion.
right. So to me, when we talk about it'd be funded through net earnings. It would be if the POA collected money, more money, we had a banner year in golf or whatever, and we collected more money than we anticipated collecting. Now there is net money to be potentially by board decision put in these funds to make them even more robust for
Yeah.
22.
It seems like this discussion leads this sentence to be curtailed significantly.
Yeah, I'm also,
Basically, after it says to be funded through net earnings excluding water and wastewater operations, you probably put a period on it
Yeah.
right there and just kill the rest of the sentence.
Net earnings less capital.
Yeah.
yeah, I would agree with that. Take out even what I wrote. I was just trying to figure out, how do you stop all these other side discussions that occur?
So everything in purple there is gone.
I would just say after
After the parentheses,
the parentheses, there's a period.
yeah. After
And
the word
then-
operations, parentheses, period.
And you delete the rest of all the purple, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna get a little bit argumentative here. My instinct is to exclude stuff like the golf surcharge. Golf surcharge is in earnings, but the golf surcharge is definitely
Yeah,
not.
but it's a separate thing,
It
so
should
it's
not go
should
into-
not included in that.
Yeah, but it is included in net earnings. It's there.
But it's already set aside. And I agree with you, Tom, we should
Right.
write a policy on what that fund is about, so we can get all the mystery out of it.
Right.
And put the mystery in writing, so that everybody knows what it's for, but
Yeah.
I don't think we need to have a long run-on sentence here that does not include the golf surcharge.
But then the sentence is technically incorrect.
So is it a third category of a fund?
Or, I mean, you can say, and other funds that are allocated to other things.
I mean, if you
Something
wanted to
like
put
that.
excluding water, wastewater, and golf surcharge,
Yeah,
period.
yeah.
That would probably be the elegant way to solve the
Well,
problem.
it's, as they say, cutting the Gordian knot. The thing is, in the future, the golf fund may, other things may occur in addition to the golf funds. We don't have to address it in this, it's just, to me, we could create some other golf fundy kind of thing in the
Yeah.
future, that's all.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
But I do think you probably need to exempt it here.
Yeah, I
Just to
typed
get
it
it out
out
of the-
for you, so
just to
I'll
get it out of
send,
the
I'll send
corner.
this to everybody after we're done here. Version, whatever we're on.
I think it's 3, I don't know.
Yeah, it'll be 3.
3 dot, unless it's the new software release, it's gonna be
Yeah.
3.3.a.6 or something like that.
So then moving on to section 3, says to establish the, and I struck out reserves as to establish the funds. The board of director has designated the following, and I took out minimum, I just said amount for each of the, instead of reserves, for each of the funds as a minimum. These funds were accumulated from existing unrestricted net assets as of 6/30/2021, and that's really what happened. We had the money from, that we had put aside in case we didn't get forgiveness, and they decided to create these 2 funds with some of that money. So that's what happened, and now we gotta start.
I only have one question there, and that's, we used net assets in this paragraph, and we use net earnings in section 2. Should we be using net earnings instead of net assets? Karina's nodded her head up and down, so I think that's a yes.
Net earnings?
Yeah.
And to just go back for just a moment in regards to where we were just talking about the golf surcharge, and there may be something applicable in the future. What if we put restricted funds? Because, I mean, that's what the golf surcharge is, it's restricted funds.
Well, we also have restricted funds,
Yeah.
period. I'm not sure what's in those restricted funds. but-
Yeah, so you just say and restricted funds instead of specifically referencing the golf surcharge?
Well, right now, we use restricted funds as a technical term. It is an item on the balance sheet. So when you say restricted funds, do you mean with the capital R, capital F, which is specific to that fund, or are you trying to use it as a broader term?
Well, I was just thinking as far as a broader term.
Okay,
as-
so then we wouldn't,
But-
we shouldn't say restricted funds, we would say other funds that have been designated as, hands-off. I hate to use the word restricted again, but that's the word that comes to mind.
Could you say funds designated for specific purchase such as golf surcharge?
Or you could say such as the restricted funds.
And what makes up your restricted funds is all of the funds held for insurance, dental, it's liability-related accounts that we hold.
So it sounds like maybe the phrase restricted funds can be stretched to accommodate the golf surcharge and anything else that might pop up in the future. Okay.
So you wanna not put golf surcharge and put restricted funds?
I think it changed the end of that exclusion to and restricted funds as opposed to and the golf surcharge. That's what I think I heard.
Because when you're saying the restricted funds that are on the balance sheet, those are strictly operating.
And that's what I'm
Bank
worried about,
accounts.
because if you're trying to tie it to her accounting and how that's done, then now we still have golf surcharge out there that does not fall in that category.
We could say funds that have been designated for specific purposes.
I'd rather say that. Okay.
I think we have to talk about, to me anyway, this concept of minimums. When you say the initial, right now, there's 1.5 million in the that's backwards. I think the 1.5 million is in the general fund and the 666 is in the utility funds. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's backwards.
Okay,
Is it backwards?
yeah. But anyway, let's just take the 1.5 million as a minimum. To me, when you say minimum, that means generally you would expect not to go below that level. And I was thinking almost the total opposite, which is we put 1.5 million and given the right opportunities, which should be, we have lots of right opportunities. My initial reaction is that should be spent as quickly as possible and then replenished on an ongoing basis. So,
So how do you account for the requirement to replenish? That's what.
that's the thing,
That's what you're
that's the-
talking about, so
Right.
I'm open to something beyond minimum, but there should be a requirement to at least pay it back.
Well, then you get into the next sentence, which is contributions shall be deposited, at a minimum annually to the accounts. I look at it as the general manager, i.e. Karina, just, and it's not clear to me what the process is, but the process has traditionally been, Karina looks at the cash account or the operating funds, it is big, writes a memo to the board saying, here's the amount that we feel comfortable to move into it, into these two funds on an ongoing basis. What I wrote later on says, I'll just read the whole thing. I propose a little more detail on deposits to funds, just for illustration, here's a short version. After the annual audit, which does, requires a starting point, and at least quarterly, the general manager will recommend to the board for approval increases of the capital funds from operating funds. The recommendation should be based on maintenance funding needs, how much we need, current and future cash availability, which is a very broad way of saying Karina has to use her judgment in terms of over the next 3 to 6 months, how much she really needs to keep in the operating funds. And otherwise, it's her job and the general manager's job to continue to feed this thing, and not on a once. I really didn't like the once-a-year basis. Sounded like it's a one-shot deal. To me, it's like almost, every month, but every month is probably too often. And then later on, I say, none of this precludes us using operating funds like we always have been for capital purchases. It's not clear to me, are you gonna spend money out of this fund first? And then actually the second source of funds is the operating funds, or you gotta spend money out of the operating funds first, and this becomes your backup. And the way the concept of minimum is written in the current document, it sounds to me like you want to use this as your backup fund. And that wasn't what I was thinking walking in the front door.
So my thought initially was, it's gonna take a while to build this account up, period, in order to fully fund it out of this. So there's no way that we could do that right now. And if we have $8 million in capital, there's only $1.5 million sitting in there. But my goal would be, and that's kind of where I was saying, if we could come up with something that would be, okay, we know at the end of, well, let me back up a little bit. We know at the end of the year, once we get through audit, because we're nonprofit, every dollar has to be designated to something. So every excess dollar is designated to these funds because we've already met our reserve limits. And until we reevaluate those, this is where all of that, any excess money should go. But what's important to keep in mind is when you're looking at whatever's left over on that report is accrual, not cash. But you have to monitor your cash position and meld the two together, which comes to your point of, I've said we can't move everything because we still need money to pay the bills that are gonna come out and keep that going. So what I would kind of think of is, for right now, we're gonna have to fund a lot of things out of our operating account. But if there are pieces, say the fire truck, say we weren't gonna finance it, say it was actually capital, just because that's the big one that comes to mind, okay? If we had to push it out to September in order to monitor our cash flow, but we really needed it way earlier, then we could draw on this account. But then once we actually are getting into a position, I would like to see us where we're using this account in order to do all of it. Because then it doesn't matter when you're purchasing your capital, you've already got all the funds needed. But how do we get to that point? That's really where I need help.
So I don't think you can ever get to that point of nirvana that you just asked for, which was if these funds were, example, $8 million for 2020 new is sitting in there. I don't think that's, the POA is not gonna ever be structured in such a way that you can do that.
Don't think you'll be that lucky.
We'll never be that lucky.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's what would be
That
ideal.
would be
We're
ideal.
not living in that.
Right, so then if we have to look at how we really realistically think they'll be used, if you look at 2022, you would ask each department to say when they want to purchase their things spread across the year,
And that's what we do.
okay? And then those that wanna purchase something in January or February, they're the ones that are gonna use this fund so that we can do it in January or February versus waiting 2 or 3 months before you collect up enough cash.
So really the way
And
that.
then once you get to that 2 or 3 months, you should have collected up that cash and you should put it right back in this fund, right then and there.
And I think
Not
that's
wait till
really-
the end of the year, but right then and there, cause if that's when you would have collected the cash in accordance with our normal cash flow, you need to put it back in right then, because there may be an opportunity later on in the year where something's, like you said, we're gonna stop all capital in July. Well, this would then say, nope, we can keep going because now we can do an expenditure in August because we got some money here to be able to do that. But by the time we get to November, you gotta put that money back, cause now we've collected that cash again.
So this is one of those, I wish there was a whiteboard up here, because I think we're all saying the same thing, but I wanna make sure. So essentially, I've got, pretend there's a whiteboard here. You know, I've got a funding level, you know, these working capital funds have been funded to a certain level. Essentially, I'm gonna use very non-accounting terminology, but essentially what happens is the folks who want to utilize that capital before we have enough revenue in there to be able to pay for it are essentially going to get an advance
Yes.
from that pot of money. So the funding level, the funding threshold there will deteriorate early in the year, expected to deteriorate early in the year. And then over time, it will gradually restore. You know, so you get to the end of the year, you should end the year no worse, unless some very unusual circumstance happened, like we had a significant revenue shortfall. You know, you should end the year at least what you had at the beginning of the year. And when you get to about the end of the year, that last 3 to 4 months of the year, where you start to have confidence in what your year-end numbers are going to look like, that's the place where the board may alter the threshold with recommendations from Karina and the general manager to say, instead of it being here next year, we believe we can add a little bit of money to that fund, which will allow us to continue to do the same thing next year, but the profile of that spending has that kind of a shape, as opposed to being drawn down to little to nothing, you know, with no repayment. You know, that's not the intent of this model.
Right.
No, and I think that is the ideal way for us to be able to operate with what our situation is. And so when we prepare the budget, I already have them spread it over the 12-month time span. And the capital piece is the one, okay, and I tell them, I need you to put it in where you need it. But then I'm gonna have to adjust it, and I will try to keep it as close to your time frame as I can based upon cash flows. And that's what I end up doing right before I upload it. And so what would be nice is exactly what you're saying. I will keep that piece if I had to put it in November, but they really needed it way sooner. I will keep it in November for my purposes, so that I know once I hit November, I'm funding it back. And then that keeps us, so we haven't drawn it all down to zero, because I don't want it to go to zero. I want us to be able to keep funding, and it's not only gonna be what's left over at year end. So that's the best analogy, I think, as far as being able to do it, and it benefit us.
Yeah, and whether you do that replenishment exercise monthly, quarterly, aperiodically, I don't think is something that we necessarily have a preference on one way or the other. I think it's the most convenient, you know, whatever's the most convenient thing to do. But the point being that when you get to the end of the year, you would expect those funding levels to restore to at least what they were in a normal year, what we laughingly call normal these days. In a normal year, you'd expect those funding levels to return to that original level. Whatever you had in December, what you had in January, would return to that level in December, perhaps with a little bit of additional funding augmentation, should that be the decision of where the funding was gonna be allocated. Essentially, to your point, until you get through the audit, until you get the end of the year audit, we'll know what those exact figures are. That's where you're going to put those, I hate to use the word excess funds, but that's what pops into my head.
Yeah.
I'd like to throw one other thing onto the table here. Ideally, I would like to see this fund act as a planning tool. We know that the O&M tables aren't always going to be linear. There are going to be spikes in it. We know that there are known unknowns that are going to require a substantial amount of money in the short-range future, some in the long-range future. I would like to not see this come back to a level like goes up, goes down. I like to see it come up and then be at a level and then put into it extra funds so that we can plan for the future. So your line, instead of going up and down to here, I'd like to see up and down here and up and down up to here as we go out, so that we're not just covering this year. I would like to put into it a planning tool that goes beyond just this budget year's needs, but some projection beyond that. And I think that this would be the tool to be able to do that planning, so that 2 years down the line, if there's a spike, we're covering the spike, or 3 years down the line. And then maybe the year after that, there's a dip, but, you know, this is a very dynamic need, and I would like to start from the get-go doing a little bit of funding that dynamic need in the future. I don't know if I said that well,
No,
but I
you-
think you were with me.
Exactly, that's the other side of this coin is.
So use it for a savings account also.
Yes, so that's what I'm saying, at the end of every year, anything that we have extra needs to go into there. Because we know that there's gonna be stuff down the road. Revenue is going to vary in different forms, and as we know from the past, you can't always 100% rely on your projection. And so even if it was to say, okay, we need to add an expense line, just to say.
An expense line to
and-
keep it funding for the
Yes.
future.
No, that's what I'm saying, and every month we will move, a portion of the depreciation expense over. Because then we know we're gonna have to recapitalize, we're gonna have to repurchase the stuff that we have now that is going out of date at some point. And it will help us be able to build for it. So it wasn't only to cover this year. And that's why I said, I don't want us to just see it go away. We need to be able to keep funding going forward, and then as you hopefully would get further and further down the road, you'd really be able to handle all of the things that would be in the O&M table that your revenues didn't cover. Because prior to this year, there was no fund over here. All capital was done over what was expected in that current year. This gives us that cushion, and if we can build the cushion to cover what we need for the current year and grow it. So no, you are exactly right in what it needs to be doing.
And what it's doing is taking this one fund to take care of the immediate, and it is using this fund also to create what Carl and I have talked about in here as a reserve replacement fund.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what
But
could,
isn't that-
what could happen, I mean, that would certainly, again, in a perfect world, you'd expect those balances to slowly increase over a span of time and eventually get to the point where you could handle a very significant future outlay. I think reality is that you're probably gonna have a little bit of volatility in your bottom line number. You're gonna start out with a number, using a known unknown example that we kinda can scope. We know we're gonna spend $1.5 million or $2 million on water tanks in about 4 years. So what you can do is you can put into place a plan to be able to build up those reserves, to be able to account for that. But in the year that you make that expenditure, when you get to the end of the year, that number might not come all the way back up to that level. You may,
The whole picture is
but
volatile.
what you've done is you've essentially saved up to make that, you've effectively saved up to buy the new car, or, to use an out of context analogy. And yeah, you know the money's gone, but now you've got the asset, so it's.
And
so
meanwhile,
there's-
you continue that process for the next one.
Exactly.
Because it's an ongoing, it's volatile, it changes, the
Yep.
income changes, the expense changes, the timing changes. Every year it changes, but you've got a process to try to handle it.
So
Yeah,
that's
because the OMT tables, over time, the OMT tables should eventually, and this is one of those concepts that people are gonna struggle with, but just because the OMT table says I'm gonna need to spend X amount of money next year or the year after that, doesn't necessarily mean I'm gonna have the money to spend. We're gonna have that same, you're gonna have that same budgeting exercise every year. You're gonna have a very real possibility that not everything that was on your wish list for next year, came in. You know, so some of those things are gonna have to be moved around, or some of those costs are gonna have to be respread over a different window, you know? So hopefully the OMT table manages the knowns, and then this gives us a position to be able to accommodate some of the known unknowns, or, God help you, the unknown unknowns that might happen.
And also the spikes that you get in the OMT tables.
Yeah.
It truly, the idea really was a savings account that we would have the money for our future needs, or our, whether it's in the current year or going forward. So no, you guys are right.
And it presents one interesting side thing that the board will have to deal with is there are certain members who cannot accept this concept. They are so used to living dollar by dollar that they can't accept the concept that the board is sitting on, the POA is sitting on these funds. And so it's gotta be a little bit of a sales job too, to explain why this is important. Otherwise, we're gonna get lots of next door and all those other people who,
Say we've got
Personally,
enough
don't work
money and
that
we're
way.
wasting everything.
yeah, what are you doing sitting on that money and then telling me you need more of my money?
We've already seen some of that in the run-up to the,
Yeah,
Well, a
the
good
assessment rate.
example is, I want new living room furniture, okay? I went out and I priced it. I've got some money set aside. I could go blow it, but I know I want this new living room furniture and I don't have enough. So guess what? I just gotta keep saving so I can go get that asset I need.
Yes.
I mean,
You know, But isn't what Becky just said in section 4, the funding philosophy?
Well,
a little
that's
bit?
where I think it comes, we talk about
We
that
need
in
to
section 4. So if we come back to section 3, do we wanna eliminate the word minimum?
I leave a minimum because I think we need a little incentive to maintain that minimum to keep growing.
I'm gonna give you the countervailing point. I'm inclined to want to eliminate the phrase minimum, because then if you do have that future expenditure where you end the year with less money than you began the year, somebody's gonna go nuts over it. And the idea being, you wanna have a funded amount, but you wanna do it eyes open. You don't wanna be, you wanna do it in a controlled manner and not in an uncontrolled manner.
So you could change this to read, to establish the funds, the board of directors has designated the following amounts for each of these funds per the table below.
Yep.
These funds were accumulated, and then you say where they came from. Boom, done.
Just take out both minimums.
And then you take the minimum word out, and then the question then becomes, so that pretty much says where they came from
And it
and what
points
we
you,
have in them.
yeah, and it points you down to the table for what the dollar values really are.
But then after that, it said, it talks about funding them annually or whatever, right? And, I think that probably should just be left up to CREDA and them to figure out how they
Yeah.
replenish these funds
Yep.
throughout the year.
Yep.
Would we want to maybe say reserve contributions, if applicable, should be deposited as decided by the board or decided by the CFO? Or,
Recommended by the CFO?
yeah,
We don't have a CFO.
We don't have.
Well,
well
Yeah,
then,
but
the controller, my
Yeah.
apologies,
whatever is the right, yeah.
another faux pas.
Would it be better to say accounts will be replenished
I like
by
that.
the comptroller throughout the year or something to give you maximum flexibility, but at least implies that that's the idea here?
I think so. Cause above, I mean, we already stated that they're gonna be funded through net earnings, so that's where their
Right.
growth will come from.
Yeah.
The replenishment should be,
Yeah, replenishment, the rate of replenishment will be at your discretion, and then any growth in those will be a function of any net earnings that we have.
Now, to play devil's advocate in the fact of if we have to use this for, say, an unknown, we didn't have that in the budget to begin with. So it wouldn't have been in my 12-month schedule to come back in. So how is that gonna be viewed if something was to occur?
Good question. So I think, maybe I'm wrong, because earlier we talked about having it as outlined in the OMT data and the approved budget. That unknown is clearly gonna smash into the budget. You know, so there's gonna have to be the appropriate budget adjustments made to account for that. You know, if you had God help, you got a bridge failure, you know, something like that, where you've gotta go spend money. It's, once that expenditure is identified, you know, the board, the GM, yourself are gonna have that challenge of, okay, now we got a problem, we gotta go fix it, we gotta go fix it now, where are we gonna take the money from? You know, do we have enough working capital to be able to cover it? If not, you know, are we do we qualify for emergency reserves, you know, other things that are available? You'd have to rejigger the budget pretty significantly if it was a high dollar unknown that hit you.
Well, that's what I'm thinking, you know, you wouldn't even have enough in the budget if you wiped out everything that you could to cover it, so
Yeah.
you'd still end up taking a hit.
Yeah. Yep. In that case, I would think the hit, like I said, you'd probably hit this fund to the maximum that you felt like you could draw it down. And then you're probably into the reserve, you know, you probably met the criteria for accessing emergency reserves.
Right, I'm just stating into the statement though of that it would be, it may or may not be fully replenished. I mean, knock on wood, we won't come into a situation for that. Under normal circumstances, yes, absolutely, but with the statement here,
Yeah.
say you're out of policy.
Okay, so I wrote, perhaps I wrote a different thing than other people were seeing. What I wrote here, the replacement note here for that reserve contributions tag was, accounts will be replenished at the discretion of the controller. That's kind of that's what I wrote. So that should leave you maximum flexibility. And if you have that event that happens where the balances are not, at the end of the year, not going to be what they were at the beginning of the year, you've certainly got well-documented rationale for why that happened.
Right, you should have a documented justification.
Yeah, you probably got a smoking hole out here somewhere that's, you can put a picture of it in there and say, we had to fix this.
It's a big responsibility on you.
Okay. Section 4?
Just to
Yep.
make it clear in my mind. So let's just take a look at that 1.5 million. Is what we're saying, it's okay to spend it down below 1.5 million, but if so, it should be replenished at the discretion of
Yes.
there's no necessity to go to the board and say, I'm putting money into the fund up to 1.5 million and beyond, or,
Yeah, we said we can grow it, so.
so
There's
in
no
other words,
restriction if we go above that.
okay, so
We're just-
basically what we're saying is this this capital fund at this point is somewhat outside of the purview or control of the board. Because everything, I mean, rightly or wrongly, and I'm not saying we've done everything right, in order to put money into these things, generally, it has, well, okay.
This-
For golf funds, it's not clear to me whether that does or doesn't require board approval. For the restricted funds, the board never, as far as I can see, ever touches it. So if this is like that, I'm just trying to understand that this thing can then be replenished and grow at the discretion of staff.
As
That's what
far
we're
as
saying.
visibility
Yeah.
to the board and to everybody else, it is an account that is listed on the balance sheet
Yes.
specifically. So they will be able to see, hey, it's gone down to 800,000 or whatever. The golf surcharge is listed out separately as well, if I recall correctly.
Correct.
And the way that that is structured is we put all of the earnings into it every month that is collected in revenue, but the only time that it is being used is with board approval.
Right. It's just that my recollection was in funding the 1.5 and the 666, Gary actually wrote a memo and the board then approved it. And now we're saying, going forward, that is no longer necessary.
No, I don't believe that's the case. I
Okay,
believe there's an A and a B path there. The A path, funding to these levels,
Right.
that funding can be used for the respective organizations to get their advances, get their capital projects started. The expectation is that it'll be replenished to that level by the end of the year.
That's it.
Exactly how that gets replenished.
Process.
Right,
That's them.
Well, the second
growth-
part,
The second part of that is I wanna grow the budget above, I wanna reset this threshold from 1.5 million to
Okay.
some other number.
Okay.
Well, when that happens, that would require recommendation from Crane and the GM, go through the board authorized that number to go from X to Y, you know, and the rationale behind going from X to Y would be these were our net earnings for the year, you know, we're gonna distribute them out this way and that way, you know, based on a rule set. And again, the board still has the positive control on that to go, yes, we agree.
And that's currently written in section 2, so in section 2, under each one, and under A, it says that, if we take out the word minimum, it says the funding levels are designated by the board of directors from time to time as detailed in sections 3 and 4. So 3 starts at 1.5 for that one fund. And it says the same thing for general capital if we take out the word minimum. So then we have the numbers right there in section 3, and now we would get into and then we said in section 3 that the accounts will be replenished by the comptroller throughout the year. Okay, so that takes care of that piece of things, and then we get into 4. So I think it covers everything that you just raised.
I think it does too. It's good to press.
Keeps the
test it,
board
make sure.
connected to it, but yet allows, I think, Katrina and the gang to do the thing.
Yeah, because I don't think the board would on an ordinary basis want to necessarily get involved in the decision of what that replenishment structure looks like. As long as somebody's got a handle on it and they know what it's gonna look like, it's their responsibility to make sure it gets there by the end of the year.
So you see it in the financial reports as it goes along.
Exactly, you'd see it, and if it was gonna be supposedly be replenished at X amount, and you look at the periodic financials and it's not being replenished at X, then there's some kind of an explanation behind why that's happening.
well, I guess my concern, and the word concern is not, it's overstated, it's not the right word. Wasn't up to the 1.5 million, it was beyond, going up to 1.6, 1.8, 2.5, you know, that part, okay.
Okay. Section 4.
Section 4. I just added clarity on how that would be used in the first paragraph by saying that adequate funds, both current operations provide timely execution, saving of capital projects, which may begin at the beginning of a budget year when revenue has yet to be collected, or which will require funding over multiple years. I don't know if that's absolutely necessary to be in there, but I was just trying to get somewhere this whole thought of this is how it should be used. Now, based on what we said in our previous discussions, there's some words here we probably need to change out, like capital projects, and we can change that to approved capital and.
Yeah. I like
Just
the
a minor
concept.
thing, and it's because of the way my brain thinks. I would like to see section 4 become section 2. The way my brain works is we're describing what it is, why it is, and then we go into the details. And I would rather have the description up front and then the details follow, instead of part of the description, then the details, and then more words about the philosophy. And again, it's just the way I mentally organize things, but I would like to see the philosophy be section 2 before we get into the details.
I'm not sure about section 2, but maybe, I understand your point, maybe maybe section 4 goes up and becomes a new section 3.
Yeah, it becomes right up at the front.
Yeah.
And then we get into the details of, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and then here's how we're doing it.
Yeah, here's our philosophy, and then here's how mechanically how we're doing it.
Yeah. And
Okay.
again, it's just
Good thought.
because of the way I think.
Yeah. It's that retired engineer thinking gets you in trouble every time.
Can't help it.
I'm sympathetic.
Then there was a comment from Kathy about large expenditures. You said, Larry, that you thought it was covered. I don't know if Kathy wants to talk about that or not.
Well, I think the only reason I put that in there is and maybe this is more a Karina question than my question, because I'm not sure where that shows up in our books. You know, we talked about it being funded out of net earnings. So if there was a grant or a donation or anything like that, is that part of net earnings?
It'd have to be recognized as other income, yes.
Okay.
Now, I don't see a reason if everything's going like it is right now, and we know we're in excess, not in excess, we have unused budgeted funds. And we know we're not going to expense those. I don't see a reason why, if we came upon that, yes, you'd record it as other income, but you couldn't take that amount and go ahead and designate it over here. And that's where it comes back, if we did that, we would create an expense line or something as well to kind of show something, not necessarily an expense, but track it so that it would back out.
Yeah, you show the asset going in, you show the expense coming out, basically.
In some form or fashion,
Exactly.
yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Now, other comments that were in there had to do with targeted minimum funding levels, but Tom, we would take that out based on our conversation before, right?
I would think so.
And then you had a comment more that went to our conversation about what happens if an emergency happens, and will we use this first, second, third, or fourth? Do we need to have that in there, is the question.
Do you want to mandate it? That's really the question. I think it depends. You know, I think the hard part trying to set criteria around that is you've got so many potential exemption conditions in any kind of criteria you establish, you'd end up with 5 pages of really
When
complicated
that
stuff.
situation happens, obviously the controller, the GM, the board are gonna have to sit down and think about how they're gonna do
Oh,
that.
yeah.
They're gonna have to look at all the different pots of money and all the different strategies on how they go forward.
Yeah,
And
agreed.
if they're gonna potentially push on this one or, you know, stretch a policy, it's an emergency, so that's what they get paid to do.
Yeah.
And then we'll,
I mean,
Fix it out.
realistically, had that tornado line cranked up
Yeah.
about 45 minutes earlier on Saturday afternoon.
Yeah.
We might not be having this meeting here right now, or it might be an open air meeting. You know, so if those things happen, it's kind of all hands on deck. You've got to go figure out, you got an immediate need, and you got to go figure out how to deal with it. And it's probably going to be dynamic.
yeah. So going to the next section 5, there wasn't any comments from anybody on section 5. On section 6, we just took out the word reserve fund and just put fund shortfalls.
So my question,
Tom, you
my question
changed the
with
same
section,
thing.
my question with section 6, since we just talked about the reality that those levels may change, is section 6, do we need to keep section 6? Or are there still cases where we might have, I mean, if we had, if we had a scenario like we had in 2020, where another pandemic hits in the middle of the year and all of a sudden revenue dries up that we anticipated having, we could end up in a situation where this account's going to be reduced, could be reduced for a couple of years, but
Well, that's
since
kind of
we
what
haven't
it says
established a
already, though.
minimum.
It basically says that. It says, these fund balances will be dynamic and variable. Okay, we talked about that. It is suggested, however, that the minimal levels defined in section 3 be available at each year end to support subsequent year operations. Okay, try and climb it back up. And then says, if they fall below 80% of the balances in section 3 at year end, we have 3, 2 years, whatever number of years to try and work our way back and we can put it as a goal or whatever if we want to give ourselves an even or further out.
Yeah.
I mean, when we get into that situation, it's gonna be, it's kind of like the reserve funds that we had or didn't have, 5 years ago. I mean, you're gonna have, if you start at 0, you're gonna have to make a commitment each year to start adding back in to get back to that point. So.
Yeah. Okay. And Tom had a comment of adding minimum balances, but I think we talked about that already. I think.
Yeah, here's what here's where I'm ending up. Let's just say the 1.5 million, that seems to me more like a target as opposed to a hard floor.
It's a starting point.
Yeah, it's a starting point, and I'm wondering if we really should have what's essentially a hard floor, more like 200,000 or something, or you usually have a blinking light system that says, 1.5 million is green, 700 or 500,000 is yellow. When you hit 200,000, then probably things are starting to go wrong, then we have to talk about it. But the 1.5 million is sort of your target during the year. You want to fluctuate around that, but over time at year end, which is almost totally different, that's your target. That starts to become more of an enforceable minimum. And that's what this is saying to me, that at year end, you don't want to see that at 300,000.
Correct.
During the year, if it's 300,000, it's not that big of a deal.
Right.
But, I think when I read this, I'm okay with the
It
concept.
basically says exactly what
Yeah,
you
yeah.
just said. It
Yeah.
says, it's
Well-
suggested, however, that
Yeah.
the minimum levels defined in section 3 be available at each year end.
Right, what I'm saying is, I think when this thing is redrafted, I would probably look at it and think in terms of, what are we saying in here that's within a year? And what are we saying here that's at year end, year end, year end? And then just see that
See if it
the
matches.
wording and the terminology, makes sense, and at least I understand it and comfortable with it. I would say right now, just section 6, more or less, kind of leave it alone.
Okay.
Okay.
So then we have section 7. So my input was really at the very beginning, and I was just trying to be more explicit. So maybe this, Becca, needs to be moved further up, but to me, this is, okay, the use of these funds will be identified in the budgeting process. For projects, okay, we can change that, approved capital that require funding at the beginning of the year when revenue has not been collected. These funds will provide a means for cash flowing projects throughout the year. The replenishment of these working capital funds will come from the revenue generated throughout the year that was budgeted for those projects. The comptroller will provide status on the use and replenishment. The intent of use is to allow for the execution of projects throughout the year without having to wait till enough revenue is collected before starting a project. I was just trying to be like, this is the general idea of using these funds. More than happy to have that shoot up or whatever, but.
I like the words, I'm just not sure we ought to wait this far down in the document to put them up there.
Well, it's kind of the same thing under funding philosophy, it's just,
That's where I was
Yeah,
thinking too,
yeah.
yeah.
Make it part of the funding philosophy, and then we can have the other things as the more detailed part of it.
Happy to do that? Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking it's a good paragraph to put in funding philosophy.
well, and you kind of, I mean, that, you have a good summarization for your first sentence for the funding. I mean, you said budgeted which will require funding, you know, well, I take that back. I read it wrong, but, yeah.
Okay. That's all I had in there, and then there were some other comments from Tom and others.
But then you're saying leave section 7 as it is?
Take A and move A, but leave the rest.
Now, Tom had some commentary in section 7 as well.
Right. I'm trying to think. I remember not liking B 1, 2, and 3. Because, well, why don't I just read what I wrote?
You didn't have any problem thinking with 1, 2, 3, then you added for appropriate projects, those of a longer term nature, the GM should submit to the board a
Right.
project request.
I mean, B was written initially with the needing to use the emergency funds. And that generally said to me that this had to be rewritten because, oh, I remember, under normal circumstances, I was thinking, once you approve the budget, the GM can pretty much spend the money how he or she wants within the normal policy limits. So I didn't see why 1, 2, and 3 were really necessary. That they should just, do their job. Once something's approved, it's approved and just go spend the money.
That's really talking about actions that should occur in the budget development process.
Essentially,
thinking.
yeah.
So in the
Well-
budget development process, you would think that they would analyze the reason for the funds, the availability of other resources, and the time period that they would need the funds.
Right, which is essentially the next year. And the availability of the funds is usually that, in theory, calendar year earnings.
Yeah.
And I think we beat to death the reasons for the needed funds when we reviewed the OM tables. So I initially, when I read 1, 2, and 3, I said, I didn't quite understand why you needed it. I just said replace 1, 2, and 3 with, for items approved in the budget, the GM is then authorized to spend the funds in accordance with policy, chapter 9, article 3, purchasing policy. And then for item 4, for large items which are typically beyond the purchasing policy, I would think that item 4 is just something you do normally.
Item 4.
For item 4, yeah.
Are we looking at a different item 4?
Well, item 4 is the one that says, submit to the board a project request, blah, blah, blah. So, basically, I just had a very small wording change, which may not have been necessary at all. It says, for appropriate projects, those of a longer-term nature. Which, I mean, arguably, you don't even need that.
But wouldn't the board want to know, okay, so we're gonna back up 2 months from today, when the board is getting ready to approve the budget for '22, if we were gonna use this fund, wouldn't you want the GM to tell the board, hey, in next year, we've got $8 million in capital projects, and the following capital projects, we're gonna cash flow using these funds to get started in January or February, so that everybody is tracking, we plan to use them there, and we're also looking at potentially using these, or gonna use these in July and August for these.
I mean, I think those are good things to do. I
Would
mean,
we not want that to happen, or would the use of these funds just happen behind the scenes and no one would know when they're being used or whatever?
Well-
Because the next few sentences or points say, and report on that to us, and tell us what you're doing, so how we do it?
well, here's the way I view things working right now, and I'm not saying it does leave the holes that you're talking about, which is, for the capital, the board approves the capital budget, which is right now is aligned, there's probably about 150 lines in there totally. $8.5 million or something like that. It does not break the capital budget into time periods. Right. And I agree that, I mean, the entire budget is not broken into time periods.
Which is part of the problem, my personal
Right,
opinion.
and what happens is, each month, we get a report that says, here's where we have, here's the money that came in, here's the money that was spent, and we compare that to budget, and that's for January and February, et cetera. And that's the first time anybody other than Karina has seen that. I mean, I've never seen it. And then when you look into the, way down toward the end, there's the capital report, which kind of does the same thing. It says, here's the amount we spent on capital, and here's what has been budgeted. And should those things be reported? The answer is, yeah, I suppose so. But that isn't a problem just with this, it's a global
Well,
thing.
but then you have to tie policies together, right? You tie this policy
Yeah.
together, we talk about those capital projects that we're gonna use these working funds to accelerate the execution of.
Yeah.
And then you have the other policy that they signed out as part of getting the assessment approved that says, and we're tracking these ones, and we want you to report on those ones and say how we doing on each of those areas.
So just for.
Which is a subset of.
Yeah.
It may
broader
not,
topic.
may not be. You're talking about the budget being approved, could very well include a lot of infrastructure repair or replacement.
It will.
So it isn't separate from the budget. It's,
No, it's just, we're talking about when does it get done. This funds are about when does it get done. And the point, the challenge that the board has had since I've been paying attention is the board can't tell you when things are getting done. Given the fact that we just got an assessment approved to do some stuff, the board better have the ability to tell the villagers when roads are gonna get fixed and when sewer lines are gonna get fixed and when these things are gonna get fixed.
Five,
Do you mind if I close you off so we can work over here?
The only thing we asked her is the camera
The camera,
is recording our stuff. If it's able to pull it forward, no problem.
focus it.
I don't know if Paul might be next door in the Woodlands, but as long as you can do that piece,
Thank you.
no problem, sir. Sorry about that, sir.
Well, assuming that we are gonna end this meeting in the next couple of minutes,
Maybe before Paul gets back,
Yeah.
we'll make him happy.
you bring up what I would say a novel point as far as I'm concerned, which is, where does the monthly budget come from? I suspect that it comes from Karina, and to put in a plug on camera, last year was the first year I recall seeing a monthly budget, And I thought that was the coolest thing ever, so thank you. But if you want to attack that on a policy basis, I think that'd be great for us to recommend. Putting it in here, if that's the backdoor way to do it, then let's do it.
I was just trying to link it to the other policy that we wrote, and then this policy would be a supporting policy to that, all kind of moving us in the direction of being a little bit more deliberate in a planned way of when we're gonna be doing things and telling everybody that that's what we're doing.
Okay.
That information will come out. There will be some simple things that will come out easy for people to understand of how much money there was and where we're at project-wise. And then there's gonna be another layer of detail, whether that comes out in the same piece or not. But like I said before, my whole goal is in the areas that are gonna be specified and dug into a little bit more. It's all gonna have job numbers, there's gonna be a timeline that's gonna be out there. Public Works is working on trying to pull something together so that they're able to say, okay, here's our schedule of work to be done. You may not be till 2023, but here it is. And so then our numbers are gonna coincide. Okay, this one was done, so here's where we are on budget. This is where it went. So I think we will be presenting that information in a much more detailed manner.
So it would seem to me that if we had that in this policy, she's already gonna make it happen anyway, so it just seems like it ties it together.
Okay, I'm good with it.
The only piece that you're asking for, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you're asking for a month-by-month breakdown of the budget and knowing what the spread is for what's gonna use these funds. And right now, I've had them spread everything, but then once the budget gets approved, I've gone back in to manipulate the time frame for capital. So I would have to do that in advance of the budget being approved to be able to identify what this would be applicable to early on.
The
Well,
board-
could we
the board
word
is not
this so
going
you
to
didn't
dig
have to
down.
do that, but you at least had to report on that?
The board
I
is
think it
not going
already
to
does.
interfere with operations to that extent.
Yeah.
No. It won't happen.
And it kind of, as I understand it, what this is just to keep you from having to reallocate the capital based on anticipated income.
Right.
You know, so you won't have to, and then I liked your idea of expensing it when it's normally gonna be, and that'll go, the replenishment would go back here.
Yeah.
And then I think as this says is provide a quarterly reporting of where this is and how you plan to replenish it, it seems adequate to me without causing you a whole lot of extra work, which you've already got now with the OMT.
That's why I said, you'll see a balance in that account on your balance sheet every month regardless. You know, so, yeah, maybe there's something I could do, I would say quarterly, that would show this is where those funds went. A reconciliation if that's what the board ends up wanting. But I would think the main goal here would be as long as you guys see funds are replenished and things are on track and projects are being complete, as long as at year end, it's all put back in, but.
Yep.
Yeah.
I guess what, we do need to think about what she said here, because number 4 says, submit to the board project requests including a description of the project and resources needed and appropriate timelines. It doesn't say when that has to occur. So that doesn't say prior to board or budget approval or when it does, but obviously it would need to be done so that Karina could then say, okay, we're gonna use some of these funds to accelerate this in January or whatever.
Certainly
So
has
there's
to be done.
There's enough maybe open flexibility there that you guys could sort that.
I don't think that should be any issue at all, because anything that is over 50,000, whether it's budgeted and approved or not, has to go to the board.
Yeah.
Within that memo, there's absolutely no reason that we wouldn't be able to state these funds are needed. You know, it was a project that,
It's kind
And
of be used,
we'll reuse.
you're gonna use the working capital funds to make it happen.
Yeah,
Okay.
and you may get into situations too where, you know, hypothetical example, you decide you go start doing those water towers. That may be a program that extends over a couple of years.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
why I was
based on
glad to
cash
see
flow,
the
you
multi-year thing.
you may wanna say, you know, we're gonna spend part of this budget this year because we have the money, you know, and we're gonna do site prep or whatever the, you know, precursor work is. And we're gonna go ahead and drop the order for the tank, but we know the tank won't be here for 8 months or whatever it might happen to be, so, you know, that's gonna be a 15, 18, 20-month project, you know, so the expenditures are gonna be stretched over a couple of years, 3 years, whatever it might happen to be. We had some additional notes.
You want me to keep going?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we're just about to the end, so yeah,
Okay.
I'd like to close it if we
All
can.
right. This is probably a completely gratuitous comment. The existence of capital funds does not preclude spending on maintenance, et cetera, from operating funds. Yeah, and like I said, that could be totally gratuitous. Under quarterly reporting, I made a comment about reconciling the funds and affirming compliance to the policy. I think ultimately what the quarterly reporting should be might be a slightly open issue. It's not that big of a deal, but I'm pretty much looking to see, you know, just maybe a little bit clearer definition. I think we talked about, can capital funds be used for non-capital items? I think the answer is, at this point, no.
No,
So, okay. We did talk about longer-term funds. I had a question. If we were to commit to a specific longer-term project, like the Westgate expansion, you mentioned the water towers, might we set up a specific segregated fund or just start stuffing money in it without really tagging it? And so the issue is, in the future, for longer-term projects, would we go through tagging it just like the golf surcharge is specifically tagged? I don't think we have to resolve that today. It's just something that I had a question about.
I could see it, I could see the answer to that one potentially being it depends.
Yeah,
If
I think that's a good answer.
If there's political capital to be gained by creating a targeted fund for something because there's a popular groundswell for something to happen, then great. You know, but in general, what you're really trying to do is using net earnings, be able to increase these funding thresholds to allow us more flexibility
Right.
and more freedom going forward.
Then we're going to the growing year-end targets, going from 1.5 million to something a lot bigger. Yeah, okay.
And again, this may be naive, but doesn't that take place with the O&M updating that each year?
Yes.
Doesn't the planning for
Yes.
future projects? Yeah, so we're duplicating again, I think.
Kind of, we're duplicating, we're tying together.
I would contend we're tying it together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the activities are gonna happen at different points in time. You know, you're gonna have sometime, I would assume relatively early next year, there's gonna be an updated 7-year table with 2022 actuals, 2022 budget lines there. Anything that fell out of 22 reallocated, and 28 budget line put into place. You know, that exercise would probably start in front of the budget cycle, you know. And then during the budget cycle, we go through the exercise to determine how much money are we gonna have, how is it gonna be allocated. That's where the wish list of the OMT table meets the reality of how much money mom and dad have. And, you know, then the budget, just the hard budget decisions get to be made. You know, then you baseline that budget in the fall, wash, rinse, repeat. You get into 23, you're gonna do the same thing. You're gonna do the OMT update, you're gonna do a 29 budget. you know, and it's just a matter of getting everybody into that cycle and figuring out where's the right point in time for that to be able to take place, where you have the information that you need to be able to answer the question without having to fake data, but it's early enough that it's actually useful for the planning.
Well, going forward, hopefully, my plan is to rework the O&M table to be more fitting to the way that the budget is prepared right now, so breaking them out into further sections. But then ideally, it is that they're going to have the O&M table for 2023, which they've already started working on, which has the 2022 data in it. There will be a column added that will show what the budget was. Okay, so then when they're gonna update for 2023, any changes, there should be a highlighted figure or some way of tracking that shows if it's being moved out or whatever the case is, with a column from what's actually gonna hit the budget. And then that way, all of that information is there and you guys would be able to see, okay, this is something we had from 2021 that didn't get executed, we moved it to 2023. This is what is supposed to be executed according to the budget and tie it together.
One experiential warning on that one. The thing that they'll have to remember to do when they do that forward spread is don't just push everything into next year.
Oh, yeah.
We used to have that problem with, when we do schedule updates, everybody would push BCWS out a
Creates a
month.
bow wave.
Yeah, and you'd create this massive bow wave that would never die, you know, and it just got bigger. It looked like a tsunami, it just got bigger and bigger. So not only do they have to look at just next year, but they'll have to look at subsequent years.
Oh, yes.
Because now, the good news is for the next 3 years, we have a relatively accurate projection of what our revenues are gonna be going forward. You know, unlike predecessor years where we were dependent on the dice roll of CPI for 22, 23, 24, we have a real good idea what our revenue's gonna look like.
Well, and that's the whole reason of having this, the entire 7-year projection. It's not a 1-year projection.
Exactly.
It is to be aligned the way it needs to, so.
Anything else?
If we're gonna call a meeting, just to make sure, we're not having a meeting in 2 weeks.
We are not having a meeting in
Okay.
2 weeks. Our next meeting will be our first scheduled meeting in
January 10th.
January 10th.
Just for GPs with this, I've got some notes which may have the word snooze in it. If I do it, are you going to send out?
I'm
'cause
gonna,
you
when I
put-
get home,
yeah.
I'm gonna send out, I was trying to
The
type
changes.
as we did it, so I'll send out version 3 of it, and, you know, feel free to, no, that's not what we said, delete, add, subtract, multiply, divide.
As a result, the minutes will be somewhat minimal on this meeting, but I'll incorporate what you put out. Super.
So I had two questions. One of them we already talked about a little bit, and one of them sounded like maybe we already dealt with. Just for my own edification, because I've been keeping track. The change of policy from reserves to emergency reserves, I know that was passed up to the board. I am not sure, has the board actually acted on that policy, put that policy into place? If not, do we have an ECD for when that's gonna happen?
I lost track of that.
Okay. So it was, you know, a month or so ago, whenever it was,
I think it got approved at the same time we did the other policies, but
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure. I can check with Katrina
Okay.
and get verification.
Okay. And the only reason I'm asking is we had created a subcommittee of Karina, Carl, and Ford to go sit down with the bankers, once that policy was approved, to sit down with the bankers and try to figure out what's the right asset mix for investments and all of that sort of thing, given that change of approach for the reserves. And I'd like to understand what the ECD might be for that, but I don't know whether or not the policy's been approved or not, so I don't know if we've cleared the gate and can start working that problem. The second one was kind of related to what we were just talking about with the OMT table updates. Thank you, Gary, for the board calendar, and Corinne also sent the budget calendar. didn't know if you had an idea, Karina, when that budget calendar might be updated to take into account all these OMT table tweaks and all of that sort of thing.
I hadn't done it yet. I will get it out probably within the next several weeks. But what I expect is that everything would be hard shut off with the O&M tables for review by the end of first quarter.
Okay.
Then that gives 3 months of building budget and reviewing O&M tables, and that can kind of coincide. You know, it'll go O&M tables and then go right into the budget.
Cool. Sounds good to me.
I mean, is that something that seems fair to you guys, or? A lot of them have already worked on updating it, not everybody has.
At first blush, it seems like it would, because that would give us the opportunity to look at the O&M projections, and if we see something in there that looks odd, you know, we can call it to the staff's attention before you get deep into the budget cycle. And that was really kind of the idea, is make sure we had it far enough in advance that, you
Yeah.
know, if there was something funny in there, we'd be able to adapt.
Well, and I'm more specifically asking, is that too late in the game, or are you guys?
I think from our standpoint, it works. If from the overall budget cycle with your staff team, if it works, I think it works for us.
Because then hopefully the budgeting side of it will go a little bit smoother, especially if it's all rolled into the same data.
Yeah.
So,
It'll get easier once it gets through the cycle once or twice. You know, people get used to that approach, and, you know, it becomes easier the second time you do it and the third time you do it. So, with that was some
Well,
of the
this may be a little bit early on the OMT update. The two thoughts, the first is probably not necessary, but last year's version, the implementation of the high, medium, low was not universally implemented. I assume that the next version, everybody's gonna be using the same definitions. There's no need for us, I assume, to discuss the definitions. I don't think we ever thought that they were anything wrong with them. The second was the handling of future expense increases. My recollection was, it was a little bit inconsistent. Do we, as a committee, care to try to tackle the question of long-term expense?
that was, for
Or
the most
are
part,
you-
put in a 3% increase, because that's your normal base.
Well, on the
Percentage as far as
OMTs, they're
expense.
done in somewhat different ways. I mean, in some cases, for like, you know, the cost of a truck, sometimes it looked like they weren't increasing, other times they were increasing, and they were just even dollar amounts, like $5,000.
Oh, I thought you were talking about expenses. The
No, not
expense
expenses,
section was the
mostly I'm
3%.
talking about the capital expenses, and in some cases, you would have the same part in 2 years that were exactly the same. Stuff like that, and I mean, is it gonna be that big of a deal? Probably not. The other issue really is, right now, we are seeing expenses well beyond 3%.
Oh, yes.
And I understand 3% being a long-term projection. I'm more concerned with using 3% for 2023.
No.
That's really my concern. So,
You are
anyway.
right. I'll give you an example. Pair of brakes typically cost, what, $40 to $60 for the set. We replaced a pair of brakes, and I just know from my husband's like, can you believe this? And the invoice hasn't even been turned in yet. Regular truck, $780 for a set of brakes.
It better be really good brakes.
We buy them from a van, out of a van in a rest area.
They could not find them.
Yeah,
They,
that's
it
exactly
took
it, yeah.
going through multiple vendors to even find them, and they found them through a dealership.
Yeah.
They got them from the manufacturer in Texas.
And they knew
So-
they didn't, and they knew they had a rare commodity. on them, and they
So
took
that's
advantage of it.
parts only, you're saying, or is that at a dealership?
No, that was the part. They
Oh.
shipped the part to us.
Jeez.
Lord. Yeah.
So-
So I think the real key is what assumptions what assumptions should we be making as we go into
As
the
far as
twenty-three
current
budget
year.
cycle? What assumptions are we gonna be making for salary appreciation and for general inflation? I think those are one of the big
Yeah, but I mean, given that the OMT is way up front, and I don't know that this committee needs to promulgate anything, but I guess it would be nice to know that, A, what is it that you guys are coming up with in terms of uniformity across everybody? And, you know, given our current environment, what is the staff doing in estimating costs for 2000, in particular 2023? I don't know about 2024. I mean, you just want to use 3% applicant, it's fine. And if you end up thinking 2023 is 3%, you know, fine, we just would like to know that, that's all, early on. That's it.
And I'm all for it rejiggering the OMT table, it lines up easier to the budget. If there's some mechanics to make that happen, clearly that would be, we'll adapt to the data that we see. So with that,
Yep.
anybody have anything else before we close the meeting? If not, everybody have a wonderful Christmas and New Year's, and we will see you after the holidays. And, motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
Second? Second. All in favor?